I didn't think much about buying a car off Craigslist. I'd done it a few times before, each transaction ending with a handshake, some paperwork, and a drive home. But this time, it felt different from the start. My name's Jake, and I suppose you could say I'm a bit of a car enthusiast. I don't mind meeting strangers in odd places if it means snagging a good deal. That's what I thought I was getting when I saw the ad for a 1999 Chevy Tahoe listed at half the usual price. The listing had minimal details but enough photos to catch my eye. And the Tahoe, with its matte black paint and almost new tires, looked like a steal. The seller, a guy named Chris, was quick to respond to my message. His responses were short and a little too eager, but he agreed to meet me later that evening in a parking lot a few miles out of town. I pulled up, and Chris was already there, leaning against the Tahoe under a flickering light. Something about the way he watched me from the shadow made me pause. He didn't wave or move, just stared as I parked and got out of my car. "Hey, Chris?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He nodded, eyes scanning me like he was sizing me up. He was tall, wiry, and had an odd calmness about him that immediately set me on edge. But it was late, I was tired, and I just wanted to get the deal done. The Tahoe looked even better in person, clean, almost spotless. But as I circled the car, inspecting the exterior, I noticed something unsettling. A small scratch on the rear bumper, and next to it, a dark stain that looked like dried paint. Or maybe something else. "Yeah, that's nothing," Chris said, following my gaze. "Just some scuff from the last owner. It's been taken care of." I nodded, deciding not to dwell on it. After all, it wasn't uncommon for used cars to have a few quirks. But as I climbed into the driver's seat to check the interior, an uneasy feeling washed over me. The cabin smelled faintly of bleach, and I could feel Chris's eyes boring into me from outside the window. It was like he was watching my every move, waiting to see how I'd react. "Mind if I take it for a spin?" I asked, turning to look at him. He hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "Sure. Just be careful with it." That last line struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. As I turned the key in the ignition, the Tahoe rumbled to life, the sound echoing in the empty lot. I rolled down the window to let in some fresh air, trying to shake off the claustrophobic feeling that was creeping up on me. As I pulled onto the road, I noticed something strange. The passenger seatbelt was frayed and stained in the same way as the bumper. I reached over, running my fingers over the rough fabric, and felt a chill run down my spine. Why would only one seatbelt be damaged like that? I glanced in the rearview mirror and could have sworn I saw something shift in the back seat just for a second. A shadow, maybe, or a trick of the light. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. Just the dark leather seat staring back at me. I turned onto a deserted road that ran along the outskirts of town, where I could pick up some speed without any traffic. But as I accelerated, the Tahoe started to feel heavier, like I was hauling extra weight. It didn't make sense. I'd driven Tahoes before and they never felt like this. The dashboard lights flickered, and suddenly the radio crackled to life, even though I hadn't turned it on. A faint, garbled voice came through, broken and distant. It sounded like someone whispering, almost pleading. I froze, gripping the wheel as I tried to make out the words. The voice grew louder, more desperate, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I hit the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The voice stopped, and the radio went silent. My heart pounded as I glanced around, but there was no one. Nothing but the empty road and the shadows stretching across it. I was about to turn around and head back when I heard a loud thud from the back of the Tahoe. It was so sudden and forceful that it shook the whole car. I whipped around, and there it was. A handprint smeared against the inside of the rear window. Fresh, like someone had pressed their hand there just seconds ago. I stared, frozen in terror. The handprint slowly faded, leaving only a faint outline, but the feeling of someone watching me, someone trapped inside the car, was undeniable. I threw the Tahoe into reverse, heart racing, and sped back to the parking lot where Chris was waiting. I didn't care about the car or the deal anymore, I just wanted out. As I pulled up, Chris walked over, a smug smile creeping across his face. "Change your mind?" he asked, his voice mocking. I shoved the keys back into his hand, barely able to look him in the eye. "What the hell is in that car?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, studying me with a calm, unsettling gaze. "It's not what's in the car, Jake. It's who." He leaned in, whispering so close I could feel his breath. "Let's just say, they weren't ready to let go." Without another word, I backed away, leaving the Tahoe and Chris standing in the shadows. As I got in my own car and sped off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time, and in the dim glow of the lot, I saw the handprint reappear on the Tahoe's back window, like a silent, lingering farewell. When I saw the listing, I was intrigued. An old solid oak chest for just $50? The ad had barely any description, only a handful of photos showing the chest from different angles, the wood dark and gleaming with age. But the ad's title, "Vintage Oak Chest, $50, must sell fast," was enough to reel me in. My name's Erica, and I'm a bit of a thrift fanatic. Something about old furniture and forgotten treasures speaks to me. Little did I know, some things are best left forgotten. The seller, a woman named Janine, responded almost immediately. She sounded relieved when I told her I'd come by that evening to pick it up. She didn't say much on the phone, only that I'd recognize her house from the chest sitting outside on her porch. I arrived just after sunset, and sure enough, the chest was already waiting for me, positioned just a little too perfectly under the single porch light. The house was older, nestled between thick trees that cast long shadows across the yard. As I walked up, the front door creaked open, and a thin, frail-looking woman peered out. Janine looked older than I expected, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a messy bun and a look in her eyes that seemed both eager and haunted. "You came," she said softly, her gaze shifting nervously between me and the chest. "Thank you for taking it." I nodded, brushing off her odd tone. "It's a beautiful piece," I said, running my hand over the wood. The surface was smooth but cold, almost unnaturally so, and I felt a strange chill race up my spine. Janine let out a shaky laugh. "Yes, beautiful, and old. Very, very old." She handed me the $50 back, refusing to take it despite my protests. "Just take it, please. And do not open it tonight." Her words hung in the air as she disappeared back into the house, closing the door firmly behind her. I stood there, a bit unsettled, but chalked it up to her eccentricity. Maybe she was just a lonely old woman who'd finally decided to part with a cherished possession. Back at home, I placed the chest in the corner of my living room. The old wood fit perfectly with my vintage aesthetic, but as I stared at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. I ignored Janine's warning and decided to open it, if only to see what it might hold. The hinges groaned as I lifted the lid. Inside, the chest was empty, lined with red velvet that looked worn and faded, as if it had held something precious long ago. But there was nothing now, only the stale scent of age and dust. I shut the lid, feeling strangely disappointed. It was just an old chest after all. That night, I woke up to a low thumping sound. I thought I was dreaming at first, but as I lay there, the sound grew louder, rhythmic, like something knocking from the inside of the chest. My heart pounded as I crept into the living room, the darkness amplifying every shadow and creak. The chest was still, its lid firmly closed, but the thumping continued, slow and steady. I took a step closer, and the noise stopped. The silence was suffocating. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pressed my hand against the lid. It was cold, colder than it should have been, like it was sucking the warmth from my skin. Then, just as I was about to pull my hand away, I felt it, a faint vibration under my palm, almost like a heartbeat. I staggered back, gasping, and the chest fell silent once more. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the chest's presence in the room like a dark, looming shadow. When morning finally came, I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old chest. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Over the next few days, the noises continued. Sometimes it was faint scratching. Other times it was that slow, relentless thumping. I tried to ignore it, but the chest seemed to demand my attention, drawing me to it like a magnet. I even tried moving it to another room, but no matter where I placed it, the noises would always start up again, as if it wanted to remind me it was there. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights and gnawing anxiety, I decided to get rid of it. I dragged it out to the curb, hoping someone would take it, but by morning it was still there, standing ominously under the streetlight. I posted it on Craigslist, offering it for free, but every time someone showed interest, they'd cancel at the last minute, as if they could sense the darkness lurking inside. Desperate, I called Janine. She answered after a few rings, her voice sounding weary but unsurprised. "I tried to warn you," she whispered. "That chest, it doesn't let go easily." I pleaded with her to take it back, but she just sighed. "You'll have to find someone else," she said. "Someone willing to carry its weight. And remember, Erica, never, under any circumstances, open it at night." I hung up, feeling hopeless. But I had one last idea. Late that night, when the streets were empty, I drove the chest to an abandoned lot on the edge of town. I left it there, half hidden among the weeds and broken glass, and drove away, not daring to look back. But as I pulled into my driveway, my headlights illuminated something sitting on my porch, something dark and familiar. The chest, waiting for me, its lid slightly ajar. I was desperate for a place to live. I'd been couch surfing for months, wearing out my welcome with friends, and I knew I couldn't keep going on like that. So when I saw the ad for a room in a downtown loft for only $300 a month, I couldn't believe my luck. My name's Kevin, and trust me, when you're strapped for cash, you don't ask too many questions. But in hindsight, maybe I should have. The Craigslist ad was vague, with only a brief description and a single dimly lit photo of the loft. It was furnished, with exposed brick walls and high ceilings, a dream spot for any city dweller. The ad simply read, "Roommate needed. No pets. Preferably quiet. $300 per month, utilities included." I messaged the poster right away, and within minutes I got a response from someone named Tom, who suggested we meet at the loft that evening. When I arrived, the place looked even better than I'd imagined. The building was old but had character, with wide staircases and creaky wood floors. As I made my way to the third floor, a strange chill settled over me, but I brushed it off as nerves. I knocked on the door, and Tom opened it almost immediately, like he'd been standing right behind it. Tom was off. He looked normal enough, maybe late 20s, with a tired face and clothes that seemed a bit too big for him. But there was something in his eyes, a hollow emptiness, like he hadn't slept in days. "Kevin?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, that's me." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the prickling unease in my gut. He gave a slow nod, gesturing for me to come in. The loft was exactly as it looked in the photo, spacious, with high ceilings and a faint smell of old wood. But it was too quiet, almost oppressively so, the kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. Tom showed me to the bedroom at the end of the hall. It was simple, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the alley below. It felt cold, like no one had lived there in years. I glanced back at Tom, who was watching me intently. "So when could I move in?" I asked, trying to break the awkward silence. He blinked, as if the question surprised him. "Whenever you're ready," he said slowly, his eyes darting around the room. "There's just one thing." I waited, a nervous smile frozen on my face. "My last roommate, he left in a bit of a hurry," Tom murmured, almost as if he were talking to himself. "He didn't quite get along with the place." Oh? I tried to keep my tone light, but his words sent a chill through me. Why's that? Tom shrugged, his gaze shifting to the floor. People don't always see eye to eye with it. Sometimes it gets restless. He didn't explain, and I didn't ask. The rent was cheap, the loft was beautiful, and if the guy was a little weird, I could handle that. I just figured he was one of those artsy types with a flair for the dramatic. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The creaks and groans of the old building didn't help, but I chalked it up to nerves. The next morning I noticed Tom wasn't around, but I assumed he'd gone to work or something. His room, the one across from mine, was always dark, the door slightly ajar but never fully open. On the third night, though, things changed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway outside my room. I lay there, heart racing, listening as they grew louder, then stopped just outside my door. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I held my breath, waiting, but the footsteps didn't move. It was as if someone, or something, was standing right there, listening. "Tom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. I slowly climbed out of bed and inched toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I opened it a crack, peering into the dark hallway. It was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavy and stifling, like the hallway itself was closing in on me. The next morning I confronted Tom. I asked if he'd been walking around at night, but he just stared at me, his face blank and unreadable. "It likes to wander," he said, his voice low and distant. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I was starting to regret moving in. Every night the footsteps would return, pacing up and down the hallway, stopping outside my door. And every morning, Tom would look at me with that hollow expression, like he knew something he wasn't telling me. One night, I decided to investigate. I waited until the footsteps started, then quietly opened my door and slipped into the hallway. The air was freezing, and the shadows seemed to shift around me, but I forced myself to move forward. The footsteps continued down the hall, leading me to Tom's room. The door was wide open, but the room was empty. Completely empty. No bed, no furniture, just bare walls and a single window with bars across it. I could feel my pulse pounding as I backed away, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned, only to come face to face with Tom, standing inches from me. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where's your stuff, Tom?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "Your room. It's empty." He stared at me, that haunted look in his eyes deepening. "This place, it doesn't let go. You were the one who wanted to stay here." I stumbled back, heart racing as he stepped closer, his face expressionless. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air growing colder by the second. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But I don't know if it'll let you." I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the apartment, not looking back. As I ran down the stairs, I could hear the footsteps following me, echoing through the empty building. I reached the street gasping for air and looked up at the loft one last time. In the window of the empty room, I saw Tom standing there, watching me with that same hollow stare, as if he'd been waiting for me to leave all along.